Concrete doesn't break cleanly. It fractures under repeated impact until the structure gives way in pieces. By April 1945, that's what Berlin had become. A city absorbing pressure from every direction, its defenses not collapsing at once, but eroding block by block, street by street. This is the final phase of the Battle of Berlin, where the war in Europe narrowed into a confined space that could no longer absorb what was coming. From the east, Soviet forces assembled with weight that didn't need to move fast, only forward. Around 2,500,000 troops advanced toward the city, supported by more than 6,000 tanks and self-propelled guns and over 40,000 artillery pieces. When the offensive opened, artillery didn't fire in isolated bursts. It struck in sustained waves, hundreds of thousands of shells over hours, forcing defensive positions to fracture before infantry and armor moved in. Inside one of those Soviet tanks, a T-34, the approach didn't feel like a final victory. It felt like constant adjustment. The hull vibrated under engine strain, vision narrowed through a periscope smeared with dust and smoke. Orders came through radio, sometimes clear, sometimes broken. The city ahead wasn't a single objective. It was a grid of resistance points that had to be taken one at a time. I remember reading Soviet operational summaries that described the advance not in terms of speed, but in meters gained per day once inside the city. That detail stayed with me, because it meant the final phase of a war that had moved across continents slowed into something almost immobile. German forces inside Berlin were fragmented. Regular army units, SS formations, Volkssturm militia, even civilians pressed into defense. Numbers are difficult to fix precisely, but estimates suggest around 300,000 defenders, many poorly equipped, with limited ammunition and almost no capacity for coordinated maneuver. Fuel shortages meant armored units could not move freely. Some vehicles were positioned as static defenses, guns without mobility. The fighting compressed immediately. Streets became channels of fire. Buildings turned into strong points. Soviet units advanced, then stalled, then advanced again. Engineers used explosives to clear paths through walls, avoiding exposed streets where possible. Each block required its own assault. Each structure resisted until it couldn't. Inside a ruined building, the experience narrowed further. Dust filled the air. Visibility dropped to a few meters. Footsteps echoed unpredictably through corridors that no longer followed original layouts. A soldier moved forward, not knowing if the next room was empty or occupied. Outside, artillery continued to strike, the sound merging into a constant pressure rather than distinct explosions. I found myself returning to one recurring pattern in first-hand accounts: how often direction lost meaning inside the city. Maps became less useful as landmarks disappeared under bombardment. Units oriented themselves by immediate surroundings rather than broader objectives. That shift from structured movement to localized decision-making marked how far the situation had eroded. At the center of it all sat the government district, including the Reichstag building. It wasn't just a building, it was a symbol, and symbols attract force. Soviet units pushed toward it through heavy resistance. Fighting intensified as they closed in. By the end of April, the building was taken, but not without sustained combat that reflected the broader pattern of the battle. Slow, costly, fragmented. Below ground, in the Führerbunker, Adolf Hitler remained as the city collapsed around him. On April 30th, 1945, he took his own life. That act didn't end the fighting immediately, but it marked the point where the structure of command fully broke. By May 2nd, organized resistance in Berlin ceased. The city had absorbed weeks of sustained assault. Casualties were immense, hundreds of thousands killed, wounded, or captured on both sides, with civilians caught in the middle of a battle that no longer had clear boundaries. Step back, and the fall of Berlin closes the war in Europe. Narrow your focus again, and it becomes something quieter. A soldier pausing in a shattered street, the distant echo of artillery finally thinning. The realization that movement has stopped not because the objective was reached cleanly, but because nothing remains to resist in a coordinated way. If you're settling into this now, let it soften. You don't need to hold every street or every building in your mind, just the sense of a city under pressure until it could no longer hold its shape. There's more beneath this, the final decisions, the aftermath, but that can wait. Let the noise fade into distance, the city still, the weight lifting slowly. You can rest there. This is the entire history of the Battle of Berlin. Chapter 1. The debt the map already knew. There's a particular kind of document that historians learn to dread, not because it contains atrocities, but because it contains certainties. Operational orders written in the language of confidence about things that were already lost. In September of 1944, the German Army High Command issued directives establishing what they called the Ostwall, the Eastern Wall, along the Vistula River. The language used was specific, almost beautiful in its authority. Eine unbedingt zu haltende Linie, a line to be held unconditionally. 6 weeks after it was written, that line existed only on the paper that had commanded it into being. This is where the story of Berlin's fall actually begins. Not in April of 1945, when Soviet tanks were rolling through the suburbs. Not in January, when the Vistula collapsed. It begins in the summer of 1944, in map rooms and planning offices, where German staff officers drew retreat lines with red pencil on acetate overlays, and had, in their quieter moments, a very precise understanding of where all those retreats were heading. The city they were defending, the city they couldn't say they were already losing. It was Berlin, and the arithmetic of the Eastern Front had been pointing at it for months. Operation Bagration, the Soviet summer offensive of 1944, is probably the least famous catastrophe in the history of the German military. In the West, people know about D-Day, about Normandy, about the great Allied push across France. Bagration doesn't get the same attention. It should. In roughly 2 months of fighting across the summer of 1944, the Red Army destroyed 28 of 34 divisions of German Army Group Center. Approximately 450,000 German casualties, dead, wounded, captured, in a period when Germany had no meaningful reserve capacity to replace them. 2,000 tanks gone, 57,000 vehicles. The Central Front, as a functioning strategic entity, ceased to exist. At the Bendler Block in Berlin, where OKH, the Army High Command, kept its operations section, someone had to do the arithmetic. They did it quietly in internal memoranda that were not circulated upward. That's the thing about institutional knowledge in a dictatorship. It gets produced because competent people can't help producing it. And then it gets suppressed because the political architecture above them doesn't want to receive it. By August of 1944, German planners were already privately modelling a scenario in which the Oder River, not the Vistula, not some intermediate line, but the Oder, which flows roughly 65 kilometers east of Berlin, would become the last defensible barrier. Internal logistics assessments estimated Berlin had roughly 8 to 10 weeks of food reserves for its population of 3 million if the eastern rail lines were severed. That was 8 to 10 weeks. These calculations were never presented to Hitler. There's a specific disagreement in the historical record that I find genuinely unresolvable, and I want to flag it rather than paper over it. General Heinz Guderian, chief of the Army General Staff in late 1944, and a man not shy about his own prescience in his post-war memoir, placed his first formal warning to Hitler about Berlin's strategic vulnerability in early November of that year. The historian Earl Ziemke, working from the OKH Operations Diary in his 1968 study Stalingrad to Berlin, placed an explicit warning in a Führer conference on the 12th of October and documented that it was rejected in under 4 minutes. The discrepancy matters enormously. If Ziemke's reading is correct, Hitler had weeks more awareness of the danger and weeks more deliberate inaction than Guderian's memoir suggests. I find Ziemke's archival construction more persuasive, partly because Guderian's memoir shows a consistent tendency to slightly extend the period of his own correct predictions and compress the period of his own compliance. But this is not a settled question. Then came the 12th of January, 1945. The Vistula-Oder offensive opened on a 450-mile front. What happened next was, in raw terms of operational tempo, the fastest sustained advance of any army in the entire European war. In just over 2 weeks, the Red Army had moved approximately 480 kilometers westward, from the Vistula to the Oder, arriving at Küstrin on the western bank of the Oder on the 31st of January. Küstrin is roughly 69 kilometers from the center of Berlin. To understand how fast that is, German planners, in their most pessimistic internal projections from the autumn, had estimated the Red Army might reach the Oder by mid-March at the earliest. They arrived at the end of January, 6 weeks ahead of the worst-case scenario. Here is the bureaucratic trap that nobody fully discusses. Berlin was not formally designated a Verteidigungsbereich, a defense area with its own commander and its own autonomous supply priority, until early in March of 1945. And it matters enormously. In the German command structure, that designation wasn't just ceremonial. It determined whether a city could draw dedicated resources, whether its garrison commander had independent authority, whether fortification work could be prioritized in the supply chain. Without it, Berlin was in a legal and logistical grey zone, which meant that for the entire period from September 1944, when any competent analyst could see what was coming, through February of 1945, when the Red Army was already at the Oder, the city's defences simply couldn't be built at the priority they needed. The bureaucracy of the command structure had been designed for a Hitler who was winning. It had no mechanism for honest crisis preparation. On the 27th of January, 1945, Joseph Goebbels wrote in his diary about the public mood in Berlin. Ordinary Berliners were being told the fighting was still far away. His newspapers, which he controlled with a granularity that is remarkable even by the standards of totalitarian propaganda management, had been ordered to omit any reference to the Red Army's actual position relative to the capital. The gap between what the operational maps showed and what the city's inhabitants were allowed to know was now, in practical terms, absolute. A Wehrmacht general at OKH headquarters in Zossen, looking at an accurate map overlaid with the Vistula-Oder advance lines, was staring at a countdown. A Berliner reading the approved newspapers was staring at managed fiction. Both were real. Both coexisted in the same capital city, in the same January cold, at the same moment. I've spent time with those map overlays, the captured OKH materials now held in various post-war archives. What strikes me, and I mean this in the most literal descriptive sense, is their visual quality. The lines of retreat, drawn in red grease pencil across 1944, have a quality almost like architectural drafting, precise, measured, each one farther west than the last. You can trace, without any additional commentary, the direction everything was going. The maps were telling the truth the whole time. They just weren't being shown to the right people, or the right people weren't permitted to act on them, which amounts to the same catastrophe in the end. Berlin's fall was not a surprise to anyone who could read a military map in late 1944. It was a catastrophe that the German High Command was structurally prohibited from preventing. And the distinction between those two things, between surprise and structural prohibition, is the whole story of what's to come. Chapter 2. The General Who Disobeyed. By obeying his name doesn't appear in most popular histories. You'll find him sometimes in footnotes, occasionally in specialist studies of the Eastern Front, and, if you're lucky, in a careful reading of the German military memoir literature that appeared in the 1950s and 60s. Generaloberst Gotthard Heinrici, 4-star general, army group commander, Lutheran pietist, and arguably the most consequential figure in the defense of Berlin. Not because he saved it, but because of what he chose to do with an impossible assignment, and how clearly he understood it was impossible. Heinrici assumed command of Army Group Vistula on the 20th of March, 1945. He replaced Heinrich Himmler, whose appointment to the same command in January had been one of Hitler's stranger decisions. A political leader with no operational experience placed in charge of the primary defensive force protecting the eastern approach to the German capital. Himmler's tenure had been predictably catastrophic. By the time Heinrici arrived, Army Group Vistula was under strength, undersupplied, and operating under a command apparatus that had spent 2 months in organizational confusion. What made Heinrici unusual was not his competence, though he was genuinely gifted at defensive warfare. What made him unusual was that he wrote down what he actually thought. The letters Heinrici sent to his wife Martha during this period are archived at the Institut für Zeitgeschichte in Munich. They are short, dry, written in the careful hand of a man raised in a tradition that considered emotional excess in any form to be a form of dishonesty. 2 days after assuming command, he described inheriting a front with no reserves, a supply chain with no trains, and a mission with no achievable objective. He was not being dramatic. He was being precise. His first act as Army Group Commander was a personal inspection of the Oder defensive line, conducted over 3 days, in which he assessed the actual state of the positions his predecessor had theoretically prepared. What he found, and what he described in understated operational language in his subsequent reports, was substantially less than had been reported to OKH. Trenches existed on paper in strengths they didn't exist in on the ground. The units listed as ready were units that had been used as labor forces. And here is where Heinrici's specific genius becomes historically important. He didn't file a formal protest. He didn't produce a dramatic memorandum to Hitler about the impossibility of his assignment, the way some generals did, sometimes heroically, usually fatally. Instead, he began quietly making the only adjustment still within his power. He started repositioning his main defensive line, not to where Hitler's orders said it should be, to where it might actually function. This is a distinction that sounds like a technicality. It wasn't. The technique Heinrici had been refining on the Eastern Front for 2 years is sometimes called, in German military terminology, Withdrawal before the storm. The concept is straightforward to describe and ferociously difficult to execute. Rather than holding your frontline forces in the positions that Soviet artillery will saturate for hours before an assault, you pull them back to secondary positions, typically 1 to 2 kilometers rearward, in the narrow window just before the bombardment begins. The positions the Soviet guns will destroy with hundreds of thousands of shells will be empty. Your men will be in prepared secondary trenches, alive, when the barrage lifts and the Soviet infantry advances into no man's land. It requires precise intelligence on when the enemy bombardment will begin, because the timing window is roughly 45 to 90 minutes. Miscalculate by more than an hour, either direction, and you've exposed your men in the open. But get it right, and Heinrici had gotten it right before, multiple times on the Eastern Front. And you've turned the enemy's greatest asset into a day of expensive noise. Heinrici's problem in April of 1945 was that this technique required certain conditions that were barely present. He needed prisoner interrogations to establish enemy timing, which his intelligence units provided at some cost. He needed radio intercepts, which his signals units attempted. He needed the physical capacity to withdraw his men on short notice across ground that was partly flooded with Oder spring meltwater. And he needed, crucially, enough division commanders who trusted him sufficiently to execute the withdrawal on his timetable, rather than waiting for formal orders through channels. On the morning of the 16th of April, 1945, he had most of these things, not all of them. Now here's the source conflict I can't fully resolve, and I think it's important to sit with rather than paper over. Marshal Zhukov's memoirs, published in 1969, described the German withdrawal from forward positions at the Seelow Heights as disorganized and panicked. The clear implication was that German troops fled in disorder ahead of the Soviet assault, but after-action intelligence documents from the First Belarusian Front itself, examined by historians using post-Soviet archival access, describe a withdrawal conducted with what one Soviet intelligence assessment called remarkable order given circumstances. These aren't quite the same event. Zhukov had strong political reasons in 1969 to minimize German tactical competence. His own handling of the Seelow battle had been scrutinized by Stalin in real time, and a narrative of panicking Germans was tidier than the alternative. I find the internal Soviet assessment more credible, precisely because it's self-critical. Soviet intelligence officers had no particular reason to compliment German tactical skill in documents they expected no one to read. When Heinrici refused, in the last days of April, to order his forces to attack northwestward toward the encircled Berlin garrison, a direct order delivered by Keitel personally, he did so on the grounds that the attack was militarily impossible and would result in the pointless deaths of men who could instead surrender to Western Allied forces. He was dismissed on the 29th of April. His replacement, General Student, never meaningfully assumed the command. Heinrici himself survived the war. He was briefly held by British authorities for interrogation and was never charged at Nuremberg. And between 1947 and 1953, he sat in debriefing rooms at the U.S. Army's facilities at Fort Monroe in Virginia, answering detailed questions from American military historians about defensive warfare on the Eastern Front. The information he provided about elastic defense, about withdrawal before bombardment, about holding ground without holding positions, fed directly into American and NATO Cold War doctrine for defending Western Europe against a Soviet breakthrough. I find something almost unbearable in that detail, and I don't use that word casually. The man whose entire final campaign was an exercise in buying time he knew was meaningless defending a city he knew would fall. That man's tactical knowledge became the intellectual foundation for defending the Rhine. He taught the West how to resist what he had failed to stop. The full human inventory of Army Group Vistula when Heinrici took command is worth pausing on for a moment. His total artillery ammunition allocation for the coming Soviet offensive was approximately 22,000 tons. Against this, Zhukov's forces would fire 98,000 tons of shells in the opening phase of the Seelow operation alone. That's the arithmetic Heinrici was working with. It's the arithmetic he never complained about publicly. It's the arithmetic that shaped every decision he made, from his first inspection tour to his last refusal. Chapter 3. The Artillery Problem. This chapter has almost no soldiers in it. It has guns, enormous quantities of guns, and the mathematics of feeding them, and a system so technically extraordinary that it nearly failed in the most expensive way possible. If you want to understand what happened at the Seelow Heights between the 16th and 19th of April, 1945, you have to understand what the Soviet artillery apparatus actually was, not as metaphor, not as massive bombardment, but as a specific engineering system with specific failure modes that produce specific consequences. The first Belarusian front's artillery order for the Berlin operation, dated the 14th of April, 1945, lists the distribution of 41,600 artillery pieces along a 175-mile front. That document, pages and pages of calibers, regiments, assigned sectors, reads like a census conducted in steel. To supply those guns with ammunition for the opening phase alone required 1.23 million shells, delivered by 2,450 railway wagons, totaling approximately 98,000 tons of munitions. Soviet engineering units had rebuilt and gauge-converted roughly 1,900 miles of captured German railway track specifically to move this tonnage west. A single misrouted wagon of 152mm shells could disrupt an entire divisional fire plan. The logistics of the Berlin operation were, at the supply chain level, a feat of industrial coordination almost as impressive as the battle it was designed to support. Now here's what the numbers actually meant in relative terms. 98,000 tons. That is approximately 4 times the total bomb tonnage the Royal Air Force dropped on Britain during the entire Blitz of 1940 and 1941, delivered against a front roughly 14 miles wide in 25 hours of concentrated fire. And yet, this is the part that matters. It didn't do what Zhukov expected. At 0300 hours on the 16th of April, Zhukov deployed 143 searchlights, anti-aircraft searchlights, 60-centimeter beams, repurposed for a ground combat role. The tactical logic was genuine. Illuminate German defensive positions while dazzling defenders, allowing Soviet infantry to advance in the half-dark with a directional advantage. The idea had been borrowed, actually, from British practice. The technique had been used at El Alamein in October of 1942, what the British called Monty's Moonlight, where it worked adequately in the flat, clear air conditions of the North African desert. Nobody in the planning sessions for Seelow had adequately modelled what a 60-centimetre anti-aircraft searchlight beam does in Central European spring fog. What it does is reflect. The beams hit the dust and smoke and morning fog and scattered, creating a wall of diffuse, milky light that ran directly back at the Soviet assault formations. The Germans, looking eastward from their positions into the haze, could see, quite clearly, Soviet infantry advancing in silhouette. The Soviets, advancing into the light, could not see the German positions they were moving toward. The tactical advantage the searchlights were meant to provide had been inverted by meteorology. The German Waffen SS Sergeant Erwin Bartmann, who survived the battle and published a memoir, described looking at the approaching wall of light and seeing Soviet targets silhouetted against it with unusual clarity. He was there. He was paying attention to it for professional reasons. Then there was the marsh. The Oder floodplain between the river crossing and the base of the Seelow Heights is low farmland, cross-cut by drainage ditches, with a water table that rises considerably in spring. Soviet engineers had surveyed it in winter when the ground was frozen and assessed it as trafficable by armor. By the 16th of April, snowmelt had transformed significant sections into deep mud. T-34 tanks, weighing approximately 30 tons, began to belly out. They threw tracks. They needed to be recovered or simply left. The roads, causeways, essentially, raised above the surrounding marsh, became bottlenecks, and the bottlenecks became killing grounds. Zhukov's 8th Guards Army, which was supposed to reach the crest of the Seelow Heights by midday on the 16th, had not crested the escarpment by midnight. Here is what the artillery problem actually was, stated as precisely as I can state it. The Soviet bombardment plan had pre-registered its guns on the first German defensive line, the network of trenches and positions at the base of the heights, which was, by the time the guns fired, substantially empty, because Heinrici had executed his withdrawal. She sowed 500,000 shells in the opening 30 minutes, give or take, destroyed what was largely unoccupied ground. The German defenders were in their secondary positions in the escarpment itself, specifically on the reverse slope, where the hill's physical geometry created dead ground that artillery registered on the forward slope couldn't touch without repositioning. And the Soviet guns couldn't be rapidly repositioned because the firing data was calibrated for fixed coordinates, and because the artillery liaison system wasn't fast enough in the fog and smoke conditions to redirect fires accurately. The specific mechanism of the Soviet 152mm howitzer, the ML-20, which was the workhorse of this bombardment, is worth briefly understanding. Maximum sustained rate of fire, 1 round every 40 seconds per gun. At that rate, a regiment of 36 such guns delivers roughly 54 rounds per minute. But sustained fire at that rate heats the barrel. After approximately 200 rounds, without a cooling interval, accuracy degrades by a measurable 15 to 20%. Soviet doctrine at Seelow called for no cooling intervals in the opening 30-minute phase. The degradation was known and accepted. A deliberate engineering trade-off, volume over precision, with consequences nobody had fully mapped. 4 days. The Seelow Heights battle lasted 4 days, against a planned 48 hours. Soviet planning documents had anticipated a breakthrough by the second day. What they got instead was a succession of frontal assaults against a defended escarpment, with tanks unable to flank because the terrain funneled them onto 2 roads, with infantry suffering from the tactical problems the fog and searchlights had created, with artillery that had spent its pre-registered ammunition on empty positions. By the 19th of April, Zhukov's casualties for the approach to Seelow alone exceeded 33,000 dead, a figure Soviet official histories, published before 1991, systematically understated at approximately 5,000. Post-Soviet archival access revised that number dramatically upward. I keep returning to the Soviet Artillery After Action report that acknowledges a 23% target error rate in the opening barrage. Shells landing on pre-registered coordinates that German forces had vacated. That's approximately 1 shell in 4. 1 shell in 4 out of over 500,000. It's a remarkable admission for a document that wasn't designed for public consumption. Someone in the Soviet artillery bureaucracy, writing an assessment he expected would stay classified, was honest enough to record the system's failure alongside its accomplishment. That note sat in an archive for decades. The official history said something else entirely. Stalin, watching the 4-day delay from Moscow, did what Stalin did. He telephoned Konev. He asked whether the first Ukrainian front's tanks could turn toward Berlin from the south. When Konev said yes, Stalin told him to do it, without formally informing Zhukov. The competition between front commanders, deliberately cultivated as a management style, was now being deployed in real time. The consequences of that decision would shape everything that happened inside Berlin in the days that followed. Chapter 4. The city still doesn't know. Berlin, in February of 1945, was a city of contrasts so stark they almost defy description, and I say almost because the diaries actually describe them in real time, with a precision that no retrospective account can quite match. 3 diary voices, 3 perspectives on the same city in the same weeks. A resistance journalist, a woman who would publish anonymously decades later. A school principal who kept an institutional record because that was his habit, and he didn't know what else to do with the thing that was coming toward him. Between them, they describe a city that was simultaneously running out of everything and running in place. The cinemas still open, the ration queues still forming, the administrative machinery of the Third Reich still producing memos about regulations that would never be enforced. The 3rd of February, 1945. More than 1,000 American B-17 bombers from the 8th Air Force arrived over Berlin. It was, at that point, the largest single bombing raid ever conducted against the German capital. The bombs killed somewhere between 2,500 and 3,000 civilians, depending on which post-war assessment you use, and destroyed major sections of the historic city centre. Ruth Andreas Friedrich, journalist and resistance organizer, wrote in her diary that evening, "The city's face is changing faster than I can recognize it." She was writing in a city where the previous 2 years of Allied bombing had already destroyed or severely damaged an extraordinary proportion of the pre-war housing stock, and still, somehow, 2.8 million civilians remained. They'd crammed into basements and half-standing buildings and shelters. The population density in the city's intact areas had roughly tripled. Goebbels kept the cinemas open. This is not a trivial detail. He monitored their attendance figures personally, as an index of public morale. If people were still going to the cinema, they were still in a zone of manageable normality. The last great UFA production, a film called Kohlberg, about a Prussian town's heroic defense against Napoleon's army, had premiered in January of 1945. The film used approximately 5,000 soldiers as extras according to the most reliable estimates, a figure that has been exaggerated in various post-war accounts to numbers in the hundreds of thousands, which Wikipedia will correctly tell you is false. But the real figure, 5,000 soldiers diverted to a film production during a period of catastrophic manpower shortage, is itself remarkable enough. The Wehrmacht's logistics branch had filed formal objections to the production. Goebbels had overruled it. A film about heroic resistance to siege was being screened in a city approaching exactly what it dramatized. Nobody in the propaganda ministry appears to have found this ironic. Here is where the civilian picture becomes genuinely complicated, and where the primary sources diverge in ways I find more interesting than simple disagreement. Ruth Andreas Friedrich's diary makes clear that educated, well-connected Berliners, those with access to foreign radio, to professional networks that crossed official information channels, knew by February that the military situation was catastrophic. Her diary entries from that month convey a clear-eyed assessment that her social circle shared. The war was lost. The question was only what the losing would look like. But Traudl Junge, Hitler's personal secretary, wrote in her memoir Until the Final Hour that even within the Reich Chancellery, among the senior administrative personnel of the German government itself, the precise position of Soviet forces was genuinely unclear to many as late as early April. Not from personal denial, from a deliberate and effective information blackout at the administrative level. These accounts aren't simply contradictions. They're a portrait of class-stratified information access. The better connected you were to non-state channels, foreign radio, professional gossip, resistance networks, the earlier and more clearly you understood what was happening. If your information diet was what the regime provided, you were in a managed dark. The Gestapo was still filing surveillance reports in February of 1945. There's a document in the Bundesarchiv in Berlin-Lichterfelde, a surveillance report from Berlin's Mitte district, documenting defeatist conversations overheard in 3 different bakery queues on a single morning. 6 residents named, 2 subsequently arrested. The handwriting is neat, the formatting correct, the bureaucratic language professional. What strikes me about that document, and I've thought about it more than seems reasonable, is not the surveillance itself, which you'd expect. It's the care. The machine of repression was still running with administrative precision, still filling out its forms correctly, still following its procedural protocols, while the city it was supposed to protect was already mathematically scheduled for encirclement. The forms were being filled out. The situation they described made the forms meaningless. Both things were true simultaneously. On the 14th of March, the school principal Bayer, whose institutional diary is held in the Landesarchiv Berlin, recorded that the school's senior boys, aged 15 to 17, had been removed from his institution that morning. They were issued Panzerfaust anti-tank rocket launchers and given approximately 3 hours of instruction. He wrote, "I have run this school for 11 years. I do not know the names of 2 of the boys they took this morning." He didn't elaborate. He didn't have to. The sentence does its own work. The Panzerfaust, the weapon handed to those boys, deserves a moment of technical attention, because it connects to something we'll come back to later in Berlin's actual defense. It was a single-shot, disposable, shoulder-fired anti-tank weapon. Effective range approximately 60 meters against a medium tank, with a penetration capability sufficient to destroy a T-34. Its limitation wasn't mechanical. Its limitation was that it required the user to allow a 30-ton armored vehicle to close to within roughly the length of 2 average houses before firing. The psychological barrier this imposed on untrained teenage boys was, to put it plainly, enormous. Training records from early 1945 show that Volkssturm units, the civilian militia, received an average of 45 minutes of Panzerfaust instruction. 45 minutes. Then they were deployed. By late March, refugees from the eastern provinces were entering Berlin, in numbers that the regime's information blackout could no longer process. These weren't statistics. They were people who had walked away from burning villages, who had seen what the Soviet advance looked like from ground level, who were now standing in Berlin's train stations and soup kitchens telling their stories to anyone who'd listen. This was the moment when Goebbels' careful information management began to fail structurally. Not because his newspapers changed, not because his radio broadcasts changed, but because oral testimony was moving through the city at the pace of human feet and couldn't be censored by any bureaucratic mechanism he possessed. What this looks like when you put the three diary voices together is a city coming to knowledge piecemeal, unevenly, through 1,000 informal channels that the official information system had no tools to suppress. By February, the well-connected knew. By March, the refugees were telling anyone who'd listen. And by April, when Soviet artillery could be heard from the eastern suburbs, the knowledge was simply everywhere, and the only question was what to do with it. The answer most people arrived at was continue. Continue the queue, continue the work, continue the form filling and the ration card management and the small negotiations of daily survival. Not because they were deceived. Many weren't, not by then, but because the alternative to continuing was an undefined chaos that felt, to most people, standing in most bakery queues, even worse than the defined catastrophe that was arriving on a schedule they couldn't stop. Chapter 5. The race that wasn't on the 28th of March, 1945. Dwight Eisenhower sent a telegram to Stalin. He sent it without first notifying Churchill. He sent it, in fact, in a way that made it almost simultaneously a military communication and a political fait accompli. Because once Stalin had read it and responded, the strategic decision it contained was effectively irreversible. The telegram told Stalin what the Allied forces intended to do next. It described operations designed to encircle the Ruhr, to drive eastward, to link up with Soviet forces somewhere in central Germany. It said nothing about Berlin. Churchill received a copy. He wrote in the margin of his version, in a notation that has survived, astonishing. Eisenhower's reasoning was military in its stated form. His planning staff had estimated that capturing Berlin might cost approximately 100,000 Allied casualties. He believed, on the basis of intelligence assessments his G2 section had been producing through March, that the German military center of gravity had shifted southward, toward an allegedly prepared fortress zone in the Bavarian and Austrian Alps, where Nazi diehards were supposedly preparing to conduct a sustained guerrilla resistance that could last months or even years. The Alpine Redoubt, the intelligence called it. Mountains full of SS troops, underground facilities, months of supplies. The OSS and SHAEF's own intelligence machinery had been building this assessment with increasing confidence through the first months of 1945. The Alpine Redoubt didn't exist. It had never existed. Not as a fortress, not as a plan, not even as a coherent German deception operation. It had been assembled in the American and British intelligence picture from a mixture of Nazi propaganda about future resistance, wishful thinking from German sources who were themselves operating on rumor, and a fundamental failure by intelligence analysts to integrate the actual logistical evidence, which showed no systematic movement of supplies or troops toward the Alps. The OSS's own post-battle assessment, filed in the summer of 1945, described the Redoubt as the greatest intelligence failure of the European campaign. That's a remarkably frank self-indictment for an internal review document. Now I want to be precise about something, because this is a case where the historical picture is more layered than the standard version suggests. Eisenhower's public reasoning, the casualty estimates, the Redoubt threat, the supply line overextension, was his stated military argument. But there is a second argument, visible in declassified State Department documents from that period. Eisenhower had been briefed on the Yalta occupation zone agreements, and he understood that Berlin was located within the designated Soviet occupation zone, regardless of who captured it. Under those agreements, Western Allied forces taking Berlin would have entered the city, held it briefly, and then been required by treaty to withdraw to their designated zone boundaries. In plain terms, you couldn't keep what you'd captured. The blood you spent taking Berlin would buy you a city you were treaty-bound to hand over in a matter of weeks. Eisenhower never publicly acknowledged this second logic. His 1948 memoir, Crusade in Europe, frames the decision entirely in military terms, but the Yalta arithmetic was there, and his staff knew it. Churchill's protests were unusually direct. The Prime Minister fired a series of increasingly urgent telegrams to both Roosevelt and Eisenhower through the end of March and into April, arguing that Berlin carried political and psychological significance beyond its military value, and that the Western Allies needed to meet Soviet forces as far east as possible. His phrasing in one cable was almost perfectly predictive. If the Soviet Union captured Berlin, he argued, it would shape European politics for a generation. Churchill was 70 years old in April of 1945. He'd been watching Soviet behavior in Eastern Europe with increasing alarm for months. He was not wrong about what the capture of Berlin would mean. Roosevelt, gravely ill, sided with Eisenhower. On the 12th of April, Roosevelt died at Warm Springs, Georgia. The man who had negotiated the Yalta agreements, who had been the primary architect of the post-war framework that made Eisenhower's decision logical, was gone. The new president, Harry Truman, inherited a situation that was already in motion and had little immediate room to alter it. Churchill's warnings were about to become lived reality at a speed even Churchill hadn't quite anticipated. 11 days earlier, on the 11th of April, American forces from the 2nd Armored Division had reached the Elbe River at Magdeburg. They were approximately 53 miles from the center of Berlin. They halted. Some officers requested permission to continue. The permission was denied. What's worth understanding about that halt is that it wasn't physical incapacity. American armor could have moved toward Berlin. It was a policy decision made at levels above the division, grounded in the logics we've just discussed. The men on the Elbe who looked east and were told to stop were not stopped by geography. They were stopped by decisions made weeks earlier in rooms they'd never been in. Here's what troubles me most when I sit with this chapter. The Alpine Redoubt intelligence assessment, the fabrication that partly justified Eisenhower's decision, was produced by an apparatus of professional analysts whose job was to be right. They were not right. They were confidently, institutionally, systematically wrong in a way that fed directly into one of the most consequential strategic decisions of the European war. The raw intelligence existed to debunk the redoubt. There were intercepts. There were aerial reconnaissance photographs of the Alps that showed no systematic fortification. There were agent reports that contradicted the narrative. But the narrative had momentum. Commanders wanted it to be true because it gave them a military rationale for a decision they'd already arrived at for other reasons. An intelligence that produces what commanders want tends to survive organizational scrutiny longer than intelligence that complicates things. The Yalta Agreement's occupation zone maps, produced by the European Advisory Commission in London, placed Berlin entirely within the Soviet zone while providing for Western access corridors to the city. This arrangement, placing the Western Allies in a position of legal presence but geographic dependency within the Soviet zone, would create every crisis that followed. The Berlin blockade of 1948, the Berlin Wall of 1961, the decades-long flashpoint of the Cold War's most visible front line. All of it was structurally established in the paperwork of February 1945, before a single shot was fired in the city's defense. The map was, again, doing its slow, patient, devastating work before the event it described had happened. Chapter 6. The Noose closes. 0300 hours. The 16th of April, 1945. Along a front roughly 40 kilometers wide east of the Oder, 143 searchlights came on simultaneously. What happened next, at ground level, was not what the planning documents had specified. A Soviet Guards senior lieutenant named Anatoly Mereshko, attached to the 8th Guards Army, and later a noted Soviet military historian who wrote frankly about what he'd witnessed, described the morning in a letter written during a brief lull the following day. The marsh had swallowed a tank regiment entire, he wrote. They stepped around them. The heights above were alive with fire they could not locate. Mereshko survived the war, lived into the post-Soviet era, and spoke about the battle with the directness of a man who'd had decades to stop performing courage and simply describe what happened. His account is one of the more useful we have. The German Ninth Army's defensive position at the Seelow Heights was, by the standards of what remained of the Wehrmacht in April of 1945, genuinely formidable. Not because of its numbers, approximately 512 operational tanks and assault guns against Zhukov's 3,155, but because of its geometry. The heights themselves are not dramatic terrain. They rise roughly 40 to 60 meters above the Oder floodplain, a gentle escarpment by Central European standards. But in the context of an armoured advance, that modest elevation meant everything. The floodplain below was, as we've established, substantially impassable for tanks off the road. The roads led up to the heights through narrow approaches, and the reverse slope, the back face of the escarpment, was dead ground for Soviet artillery registered on the forward positions. German troops in those secondary positions could be hit from the sky or by direct fire from the crest, but not by plunging artillery fire from guns that were aiming at coordinates on the other side of the hill. The searchlights failed in the way described in the previous chapter. Atmospheric backscatter silhouetted Soviet infantry, German machine gun crews who could see their targets against the light. But there was a second tactical problem that the planning hadn't anticipated either. The dust and smoke from the Soviet bombardment, 500,000 shells, even landing in wrong places, produce an extraordinary amount of debris and smoke. Mixed with the morning fog and the searchlights scatter to create conditions of nearly zero visibility for Soviet forward observers, which meant that the artillery liaison system, which was supposed to allow Soviet guns to shift fire as the infantry advance developed, was effectively blind. Guns couldn't be directed to new targets they couldn't see. The fire plan was frozen at its initial coordinates, while the tactical situation moved away from those coordinates faster than anyone had planned for. The marsh consumed a tank regiment. This isn't metaphor. Soviet armor attempting to move off the causeway roads onto what the engineers had assessed as firm winter ground found instead spring mud. Tanks that weigh 30 tons behave in specific and predictable ways, in mud deep enough to reach their hull. They lose traction, they belly out, and they become artillery targets while recovery crews try to extract them under fire. The roads became jammed. Jammed roads in an armoured assault produce a specific kind of disaster. The lead elements get forward and are unable to spread out. The follow-on elements bunch up behind them, and the whole column is exposed to the direct fire weapons of whoever is waiting at the end of the road. German Ninth Army anti-tank crews at the Seelow approaches understood this. They had prepared their positions for exactly this geometry. By midday on the 16th, Zhukov's 8th Guards Army had penetrated approximately 2 kilometers into the first German defensive line. This was, against Zhukov's planned schedule, a failure. Against the reality of what they were attacking, It was genuinely costly progress. The fighting on the heights over the following 2 days has the character, in all the accounts I've read, of repeated assault against a position that gives slightly and then absorbs the assault and waits for the next one. German paratroopers, elements of the 9th Parachute Division, held specific hilltop positions through multiple Soviet assaults over 12-hour periods. Individual high points changed hands 2 and 3 times. The losses on both sides in those exchanges were geometrically disproportionate for the ground taken. The casualty figures for Seelow are one of the places where the primary sources diverge most dramatically, and I think that divergence is itself evidence of something important. Soviet official histories published before 1991 cited approximately 5,000 Soviet dead for the Seelow phase. Post-Soviet archival research, and particularly the work done by Antony Beaver in Russian state military archive documents, revised that figure to more than 33,000 dead for the first Belarusian front's approach to Berlin. This is the operational phase that includes Seelow. German sources from the Bundesarchiv suggest the figure may have reached 40,000. The earlier official Soviet figure of 5,000 is not a rounding error. It's a deliberate suppression, and the reason for the suppression is that the true figure reflected poorly on Zhukov's tactical choices and on Stalin's decision to accelerate the attack on a fixed timetable rather than allow for methodical preparation. The men who made those decisions needed a narrative in which Seelow was a swift, manageable success. It wasn't. On the 19th, the heights finally broke. Not because Zhukov's frontal assault finally cracked the German line, though continued pressure was wearing it down, but because Konev's first Ukrainian front, sweeping northward from its Neisse River crossing, was threatening to envelop the German 9th Army's southern flank entirely. Facing encirclement, the defense began to fracture. The road to Berlin opened. Zhukov's forces had taken 4 days to cross a natural obstacle that was supposed to fall in 2. The delay cost, by the most conservative post-Soviet accounting, more dead than the United States lost in the entire Pacific Island campaign at Iwo Jima. And the consequence of the delay, beyond the human cost, was that Stalin now had the pretext he needed to formally authorize Konev's advance toward Berlin as a competition rather than a supporting operation. The rivalry between front commanders that would shape everything that happened inside the city was now officially sanctioned. Stalin had the delay as justification for his next move. Whether he'd anticipated using it this way from the beginning is one of the questions about that man that doesn't have a clean answer. Chapter 7. The Defenders, What Was Left. General Helmuth Weidling arrived at the command of Berlin's defense under circumstances so strange they seem almost scripted by someone with a dark sense of institutional comedy. He'd been condemned to death by Hitler in the early hours of the 23rd of April, 1945, for an unauthorized withdrawal of his 56th Panzer Corps that had been, in fact, a sensible tactical repositioning under fire. The death sentence was issued without much ceremony. Then someone checked, realized where Weidling's corps actually was, and determined that the condemned general was the best available man to run the city's defense. The sentence was quietly dropped. Weidling was given the command. He walked into a situation that his subsequent situation reports would describe with a precision that bordered on the poetic. He did something methodical almost immediately. Before he filed assessments, before he drew defensive lines on his maps, he demanded a complete unit-by-unit inventory of every formation theoretically defending the German capital. What came back over the following 36 hours was the kind of document that tells you everything you need to know about the state of a military organization, not in its headline numbers, but in its footnotes. The official garrison figure stood at approximately 45,000 troops. His staff's revised estimate of effective combat strength, meaning personnel who possessed both weapons and the training to use them in organized combat, was closer to 25,000. The gap between those two numbers is the entire story of Berlin's defense in one arithmetic problem. The weapon supply situation was, in multiple documented instances, almost grotesque in its specificity. Volkssturm battalions, the civilian militia conscripted from men too old or too young for regular military service, had been issued firearms from whatever was available in the late-war German supply system, which drew on a chaotic mixture of domestic production and captured foreign stocks. Some units had rifles for which the correct ammunition did not exist anywhere within Berlin's supply depots. Weapons calibrated for one cartridge had been distributed alongside ammunition designed for another by a logistics system that had stopped being able to match supply to demand months earlier. One battalion commander, interviewed after the war, described receiving a shipment of weapons for which the correct rounds simply weren't available in the city. His men had guns. His men could not fire them. This is the level of organizational collapse Weidling was inheriting. And it's the level that general accounts of the defense of Berlin tend to smooth over in favor of more dramatic narratives. Luftwaffe resupply drops were the primary mechanism by which the garrison was supposed to receive ammunition as the Soviet encirclement tightened. Between the 25th of April and the 1st of May, those drops delivered approximately 40 tons of supplies in total. 40 tons across 7 days. The garrison's stated daily requirement was 50 tons. So the airlift, in its entire operational lifespan over those final days, delivered less than a single day's minimum resupply need. And a portion of those drops fell outside the shrinking perimeter of German-held territory into Soviet hands. Weidling's situation report to Hitler, dated the 25th of April, recorded all of this in dry military language. He noted ammunition sufficient for approximately 3 to 4 days of normal intensity combat. He noted that the mathematical relationship between supply and demand does not permit optimism. He was a man describing a foregone conclusion in the only language his rank permitted him to use. The Volkssturm and Hitlerjugend component of the garrison is the part of this story that I find most difficult to write about, without the prose going wrong in one direction or another, either toward a certain kind of false heroism or toward the opposite, a detached analytical coldness that feels dishonest in a different way. The factual record is clear enough. Boys as young as 14 and 15 were present in defensive positions throughout the city. They had been issued Panzerfaust anti-tank weapons and given, in many cases, training measured in hours rather than days. Weidling's own assessments noted them in multiple sectors. They were there in the records, the way anything is in operational records, as units, as numbers, as assigned positions. The Soviet forces advancing toward them were not abstractions either. They were exhausted, experienced men who had spent 4 years learning to fight and survive on a front that killed at industrial rates. The encounter between those two things is not a story that resolves into any comfortable moral category. Now here's a defensive asset that completely resists the standard narrative. The Zoo Flak Tower, the Flakturm Tiergarten, was never taken by Soviet assault. Let that settle for a moment. The most powerful single defensive position in the entire city, the one structure that Soviet forces simply elected not to attack in any sustained way, surrendered on the 2nd of May, not because it fell, but because Weidling's general capitulation order made continued resistance legally pointless. The tower was a massive reinforced concrete structure, rising the equivalent of a 13-story building, with walls in places as thick as 8 meters of steel-reinforced concrete. Its main armament consisted of 4 twin-mounted 128mm guns at the top, originally designed to shoot down Allied bombers at high altitude, equally capable of destroying a Soviet tank at 2,000 meters of ground range. Its companion fire control tower used a Würzburg Riese radar system with a range of 80 kilometers. By April of 1945, the radar had nothing meaningful to track, and the guns were running low on ammunition. But the tower itself was effectively impervious to everything in the Soviet inventory, short of a direct hit from the heaviest artillery at point-blank range. Soviet tactical planners looked at it, made an entirely rational calculation, and left it alone. It sat in the middle of the battle like a stone in a river, the current moving around it. Inside, at various points during the fighting, it reportedly sheltered somewhere in the region of 30,000 civilians. The number varies by source, but no estimate is lower than 15,000. The most effective gun position in the garrison and the most overcrowded civilian shelter in the city were the same building. Weidling formally requested Hitler's permission to attempt to break out with the surviving garrison on the night of the 28th of April. The breakout would take the remaining combat-capable forces out of the city westward, toward whatever German formations might still be reached. Hitler initially refused. He granted what was technically permission on the 29th, with the condition that the breakout could only proceed if contact was first established with German army units outside the encirclement. No such contact was possible. Berlin was surrounded. The permission was structured in a way that made it operationally meaningless. Weidling understood this. He filed the document and went back to managing the last days of a city that had been designated a fortress by a command system that had not provided it with the resources of one. Chapter 8. Inside the Reich, Hitler's underground. The Führerbunker. By the time the Soviet bombardment was audible through its concrete ceiling, had developed the specific rhythms of an institution that has lost its function, but not its procedures. Military conferences still happened on schedule. Maps were still updated. Situation reports were still prepared and filed by staff officers who understood, with varying degrees of conscious clarity, that the situations they were reporting bore increasingly little relationship to what was actually occurring outside. Traudl Junge, Hitler's personal secretary, described the atmosphere in her memoir Until the Final Hour, with a precision that no strategic account can match, not because she had access to the operational picture, but because she had access to the physical and psychological texture of the place. The smell, diesel, cigarettes, and something she called Angstschweiß, the particular scent of fear sweat that becomes indistinguishable from the air in an enclosed space where frightened people have been living for too long. The sound, Soviet artillery arriving as a sustained tremor through the concrete, felt more than heard, a physical fact that never stopped. The 20th of April, 1945, Hitler's 56th birthday. He came up from the bunker, his last emergence onto the surface as it turned out, into the Reich Chancellery Garden for a brief ceremony. He decorated a group of boys from the Hitlerjugend. Photographs survive. They show a man who has aged visibly beyond his years, moving, as Junge observed, with a heaviness that seemed to go beyond the physical. His left hand tremored with a tremor that multiple witnesses described consistently. The boys being decorated were visibly young. Some were, by available evidence, in their early teens. The ceremony had the quality, in retrospect, and in the accounts of those present, of something being performed for the record rather than for any practical purpose. Guests from the senior party and military leadership had gathered briefly. Most of them left Berlin that afternoon when they still could. 2 days later, on the 22nd, came the conference. The afternoon military briefing, at which Weidling's predecessor arrangements were still being discussed, and at which Hitler was told, in the specific, irrefutable language of operational fact, that General Felix Steiner's relief attack was not coming. The attack had been ordered 48 hours earlier, confidently, as a solution to the growing crisis on Berlin's northern approaches. Steiner had been told to gather available forces and drive south to relieve pressure on the city. He had looked at what was available, done his arithmetic, and not launched the attack. There was no army to send. When the briefing made this plain, Hitler's response lasted, by various witness accounts, somewhere between 1 and 2 hours. 4 people described it independently afterward. Junge, a staff aide, and 2 senior military figures. Their accounts agree on the essentials without being identical in detail. He said the war was lost. He said he would die in Berlin. He said those who wished to leave were free to do so. The specific words varied across the 4 accounts, which is itself evidence of authenticity. People remembering the same event slightly differently, rather than a single composed version circulating. I want to be careful here about the downfall film, the Bruno Ganz performance that most audiences will have in their minds when they think about this moment. The film, based substantially on Junge's memoir and several other first-hand accounts, captures the emotional register of what happened, but it necessarily compresses into approximately 5 minutes of screen time what, in the actual accounts, sprawled across hours. The initial outburst, the settling, the individual conversations that followed, the gradual resumption of the bunker's routines. History rarely happens in the clean temporal structure that cinema requires. On the 28th of April, the map room in the bunker served as the location for a civil ceremony of the most surreal kind. Hitler married Eva Braun at approximately 1:30 in the morning. The paperwork was completed. A local civil registry official was produced. Witnesses signed. Then Hitler dictated his political testament to Junge. 4 pages, in a businesslike tone that she described in her memoir as remarkable for its flatness, its administrative quality, as if the content were routine correspondence rather than a final public statement by the head of a state that was ceasing to exist. When he finished, he asked what she would like for breakfast. This detail, which Junge included in her memoir without apparent awareness of how devastating it would seem to later readers, is the kind of thing that only genuine first-hand memory produces. No one inventing this scene would write it that way. The 30th of April. Hitler died in the early afternoon. The precise timing is one of the places where the primary sources diverge, with witnesses giving times ranging from roughly 3:20 to approximately 4 in the afternoon. Soviet forensic teams examined the remains later, and their findings, kept classified until the post-Soviet period, have been supplemented by a French forensic analysis conducted in 2018, which examined dental remains and matched them to records maintained by Hitler's wartime dentist, Hugo Blaschke. The question of whether the right man died in the right room on the right afternoon can, on the current evidence, be answered yes. The noise of Soviet artillery had been resonating through the concrete continuously for days. Junge wrote that she was in an anteroom preparing documents, and the sound outside, the artillery, the distant small arms, the tremors, continued exactly as before. Nothing announced itself. The bunker's rhythms continued for several minutes before word moved through the corridors. That evening, in the garden above, the bodies were burned per Hitler's prior instruction. The process was incomplete. Soviet forces would find the remains days later. The administrative machinery of the Third Reich continued operating below ground for several more hours. messages sent, orders filed, the forms of governance maintained by people who had nowhere else to be and nothing else to do. It's the specific quality of institutional momentum, the paperwork continuing beyond the event, that gave it purpose. Goebbels now had the short-term future of the regime in his hands. He made one attempt to negotiate directly with the Soviets, sending a senior officer through the lines on the night of the 1st of May to open discussions. The Soviets, who had been informed of Hitler's death, were not interested in arrangements that fell short of unconditional surrender. Goebbels had no authority to offer that, or at least would not offer it. He went back into the bunker. His 6 children, Helga, Hildegard, Helmut, Holdine, Hedwig, and Heidrun, aged between 4 and 12 years old, had been brought to the bunker weeks earlier by Magda Goebbels, who had refused to leave Berlin without her husband and refused to allow her children to be separated from her. On the evening of the 1st of May, they were sedated with morphine by an SS doctor and then had cyanide capsules crushed between their teeth. Goebbels and his wife died by suicide in the Chancellery Garden shortly afterward. The documentation of all of this comes from Soviet SMERSH reports filed by the investigative teams who worked through the bunker and its grounds in the following days. The reports are methodical and bleak. Chapter 9. Street by Street. Berlin, by the time Soviet forces entered its outer suburbs on the 21st of April, had been bombed by Allied aircraft 363 times. The city that the Red Army's assault formations were advancing into was not the city of 1939. Approximately 612,000 apartment units had been destroyed or severely damaged. The rubble generated by those losses, the broken brick, the shattered concrete, the collapsed facades, the excavated basements exposed to the sky, amounted to something in the range of 75 million cubic meters across the urban area. That figure is so large it becomes difficult to hold in the imagination. What it looked like, practically, was this: streets running between piles of debris 4 and 5 meters high, buildings reduced to their structural skeleton, or to their ground floor, or to nothing at all. And crucially, because this matters tactically in a way that will define everything that follows, the rubble had converted the city into a landscape of improvised fortifications that no one had designed, and that both sides would have to work out how to fight through in real time. The Red Army had been thinking hard about urban combat since Stalingrad. The price of not thinking hard enough about it had been paid there in the winter of 1942 and 43, in blood measured by the hundreds of thousands. By 1945, Soviet doctrine had produced a specific organizational response: the Sturmgruppe, the Storm Group. Not a standard infantry unit, but a composite formation, assembled specifically for the task of moving through buildings. At its core, 6 to 8 infantry soldiers. Attached to them, a sapper sub-team carrying demolition charges, typically around 200 to 400 grams of TNT each. A flamethrower team, 1 or 2 operators. A heavy weapons sub-team with a light machine gun. And, critically, see an artillery liaison element capable of calling direct fire from 76mm divisional guns that were deployed not at their standard range, but at point blank, firing directly into building facades from positions on the street. These weren't support weapons used in the conventional sense. They were tools for demolishing specific walls with specific shells, to open assault routes that infantry could then exploit. The tactical logic of the Storm Group was to refuse the street. A Soviet combat order issued before the Berlin assault, Combat Order number 0059, laying out the doctrine for urban operations, stated explicitly that streets were killing grounds and that forward movement was to proceed through buildings rather than between them. Sappers blew holes through interior partition walls with small demolition charges. The team moved from apartment to apartment, from floor to floor, maintaining contact with the street through windows used as fire positions, rather than as routes of movement. German defenders, whose Panzerfaust teams and machine gun positions were oriented towards street-level threats, because streets were the natural approach routes, found themselves engaged from angles and through walls that their defensive geometry hadn't accounted for. This is a technique that soldiers in Berlin in 1945 called, by a rough nickname, rat-holing. Moving through the city's interior fabric, one breached wall at a time. The Tempelhof district, which Zhukov's 8th Guards Army pushed through between the 24th and 26th of April, offers the clearest picture of how this fighting actually worked at the operational level. The great Tempelhof Airport, one of the largest building complexes in Europe by floor area, a massive curved structure whose hangars and terminal building provided overlapping fields of fire across the surrounding open ground, became a major tactical problem. Conventional assault against a position that size, with the defensive advantages of a massive reinforced structure, was going to be expensive. Soviet forces made the decision that Zhukov's formations consistently made throughout the Berlin battle: bypass the strongest positions where possible, isolate them, cut their supply and communication lines, and let them become irrelevant rather than paying the full price of reducing them by frontal assault. The Tempelhof defenders eventually found themselves in a pocket that the overall battle had moved past. Then there were the tunnels. Berlin's S-Bahn and U-Bahn systems, the elevated and underground railway network, became one of the more complex tactical problems of the urban battle, precisely because they existed below the ground where the fighting was happening. German units used the tunnel network to move laterally across the city, emerging behind Soviet positions from access points that the attackers hadn't cleared. This required Soviet forces to secure tunnel entrances, which required resources, which were resources not being used on the main axis of advance. The decision to flood sections of the tunnel system, opening water gates to prevent German use of the tunnels, was made under pressure and with specific operational intent. What the decision didn't fully account for was how many civilians and German wounded soldiers were sheltering in those same tunnels, which were among the few genuinely bomb-proof spaces in the city. Casualty estimates for the tunnel flooding range from a few dozen to many thousands, depending on which source you read and how you define the event. The honest answer is that the archival record is incomplete, and the real number is somewhere in a range that the available documentation cannot narrow with confidence. The battle for the Reichstag building, which has been compressed in public memory and in Soviet commemorative history into a single dramatic event, was in reality a multi-day engagement that the sources handle inconsistently. Soviet forces reached the building and began fighting for it on the 30th of April. A flag was raised on that date. The 150th Rifle Division had been designated to carry the victory banner, one of 9 specifically manufactured banners distributed before the battle to designated formations. But the famous photograph, Yevgeny Kalday's image of a soldier raising the Soviet flag over the ruined city, was taken on the 2nd of May, using a flag that Kalday had brought specifically for the purpose, and it was taken over a building that still contained German soldiers in its basement at the moment of the shot. The Reichstag wasn't fully cleared until the night of the 1st to 2nd of May. The photograph, which has become the defining image of the entire battle, one of the defining images of the entire war, was taken 2 days after the flag was officially first raised. She over a building whose defenders had not yet surrendered, by a photographer who had come prepared to document a victory that was almost, but not quite, complete. None of this makes the image false. It makes it something more complicated, a document of a specific moment in the process of a victory, rather than of its completion. By the 28th of April, the fighting had contracted toward the governmental quarter, the area around the Chancellery and the Reichstag, where the last coherent German resistance was concentrated. The Moltke Bridge over the Spree, one of the few remaining intact crossing points, was the site of some of the most intense close-quarters combat of the entire battle, a crossing point that Soviet forces had to take under fire from defenders on both banks. They took it on the 28th. What remained after that was a collapsing perimeter, measured in city blocks rather than defensive lines, with a garrison that was receiving no resupply, had no coherent external communication, and whose command structure was operating in a bunker that had itself become militarily irrelevant to every decision being made above ground. The 75 million cubic meters of rubble that Allied bombing had deposited across Berlin's streets had, in a specific tactical sense, made the city more defensible against armor-heavy assault than it had been when it was intact. The Soviet planners had known this was possible. They'd planned for it, trained for it, equipped their storm groups for it. It still cost them. The final Soviet casualty figures for the entire Berlin operation, everything from the Oder crossing through the city's fall, were approximately 360,000 total casualties, of whom around 80,000 were killed or missing, against a garrison that, at its strongest, numbered perhaps 40 to 50,000 effective combatants. The mathematics of that exchange tells you something important about what defensive terrain, even improvised defensive terrain, can extract from even an overwhelming attacker. Chapter 10. The Women of Berlin. This is the chapter I've approached most carefully throughout this entire project. Not because the history is unclear. It isn't, not in its broad structure. But because the history has been handled so badly, so selectively, and in such self-interested ways by so many different parties for so many decades, that simply stating what happened requires first clearing away a significant amount of deliberate obscuration. So let's try. When Soviet forces entered Berlin in the final days of April and the first weeks of May 1945, they were advancing into a city whose remaining civilian population was predominantly female. This wasn't accidental. 6 years of war had consumed the male population in specific and measurable ways, in combat deaths, in captivity, in forced labor drafts, in the final conscriptions that had taken men from their 50s and boys from their early teens and sent them into positions from which most didn't return. Berlin, in April of 1945, had approximately 2.8 million civilian residents. Roughly 1.4 million of them were adult women. What happened to a substantial portion of those women in the weeks that followed is documented in hospital records, civil registration data, retrospective testimony, and in one extraordinary first-person account that was suppressed for nearly 50 years. The diary published as Eine Frau in Berlin, a woman in Berlin, was written by Martha Hillers, a German journalist who had worked in the Soviet Union before the war, spoke Russian, and kept a diary through the occupation, beginning in late April of 1945. The first German publisher released it anonymously in 1954. It was then withdrawn from the German market in response to criticism, not from the Soviet Union, as one might expect, but from German reviewers and the German reading public, who found the author's pragmatic, unsentimental account of survival to be a form of national shame. The book reappeared in Germany in 2003, the year after Hiller's death. Her identity as the author was confirmed at that point by her publisher. She had died in June of 2001, having outlived the Cold War, German reunification, and the recovery of her own testimony. The diary's first entries from late April describe something that anyone reading them without context might find jarring. A woman making a systematic calculation. She understood what was coming. She had enough experience of the Soviet Union to have a realistic, rather than ideological picture of what occupying forces could do. And she made a decision about how to manage her own survival. Her strategy was to find a single senior Soviet officer who might provide protection in exchange for compliance, on the calculation that this was less dangerous than the alternative. She described this reasoning in her diary, without self-pity and without false heroism. She was not asking for anyone's approval. She was recording what she decided under conditions that most of her later critics had never remotely approached. The scale of what happened across the city during and after the battle is documented in sources that post-war governments on both sides found politically inconvenient. Hospital records from Berlin's medical facilities in May and June of 1945 documented tens of thousands of cases. Subsequent demographic analysis, comparing expected post-war birth rates against actual births, accounting for the documented number of pregnancies terminated in the immediate post-war period, has produced estimates of the total number of women affected that range from 95,000 to 130,000 within Berlin alone, across the occupation period. A figure of approximately 10,000 deaths, directly attributable to this violence, through suicide, through violence committed in the course of the assaults themselves, through medical consequences, appears in multiple independent assessments. These are not precise figures. The record is fragmentary and was deliberately fragmented by suppression. But the order of magnitude is consistent across independent evidence streams. The Soviet military orders prohibiting this behavior existed. They had been issued at multiple command levels. That they existed and that the behavior was widespread simultaneously is a fact that the post-Soviet archival record has not resolved into a clean explanation. NKVD reports from the period document both the pervasiveness of the problem and enforcement actions against some individuals. What these documents don't resolve, and this is a genuine historiographical gap, is whether the failure of enforcement was a consequence of inadequate command attention, deliberate tolerance at intermediate levels, the logistical impossibility of enforcement across a 2.5 million man force moving through a conquered city, or some combination of all of these. Soviet official histories before 1991 chose none of the above, preferring to describe a few undisciplined individuals as exceptions that proved the overall rule. The post-Soviet access to archives has made that position untenable. What it has not produced is a simple alternative. The suppression of Hiller's diary in 1950s. Germany is, I think, the detail that most deserves attention in 2026. A woman who survived occupied Berlin through specific, deliberate, rational choices published an account of those choices. The response from her own society was to accuse her of shaming German women. The social expectation, unstated but unmistakable in the criticism, was that the correct behavior would have been to resist, regardless of consequence. This was an expectation issued from safety, about conduct under conditions of total vulnerability, by a society that was simultaneously trying to process the knowledge of what its own government had done to other populations across 6 years of occupation. The contradiction at the heart of that suppression is not subtle. It took nearly 50 years, and the author's death before her country was prepared to read what she'd written. The broader demographic aftermath has a specific number attached to it that I find clarifying in its precision. Post-war vital statistics from Germany in 1945 and 46 show that approximately 3.7% of children born in that period had Soviet fathers, as determined by surname registration patterns and blood group analysis from maternity records. 3.7% of an entire year's births in a country of 69 million people represents a very large number of individual lives, each one the consequence of a specific moment in specific circumstances that the official histories of both countries spent decades declining to address. Chapter 11. The Goebbels Problem. There is a recording that still exists. It was made on the 21st of April, 1945, inside the Flak Tower at the Berlin Zoo, the massive concrete fortress that was serving as, among other things, a functioning broadcast studio for what remained of the Reich's radio infrastructure. Joseph Goebbels delivered what would become his final radio address from that studio. The recording survives, and if you listen to it, which you can, because it has been preserved and is accessible in various archives, you can hear in the background behind his voice a persistent, low percussion. It's Soviet artillery. The guns were already within range of the city center. They were firing while he was recording. He was declaring that the enemy would be shattered before the gates of Berlin, and you can hear the evidence that the gates had already been passed, resonating in the audio background of his own broadcast. That recording is the single most precise document of institutional collapse I've encountered in this entire project, and I want to be specific about why. It isn't that Goebbels didn't know the truth. He knew the truth with greater precision than almost anyone in the German government outside the military command. He'd read the intelligence assessments. He'd seen the maps. His diary, the full version, edited by Elke Fröhlich at the Institut für Zeitgeschichte from the original shorthand records, shows a man who understood the military situation clearly. The recording isn't a document of ignorance. It's a document of a man running a system whose function was the management of public belief, continuing to run it past the point where the physical world had made that management impossible, because running it was the only thing he knew how to do. To understand the Goebbels propaganda apparatus at all, you have to understand that it wasn't simply a lying machine. It was a feedback system, sophisticated, data-driven by the standards of its time. Regional party officials, the Gauleiter, filed regular reports on civilian morale, what people were saying, what they were worried about, what they believed and didn't believe. Those reports fed back to the propaganda ministry. Goebbels' team used them to calibrate what the ministry called dosierte Wahrheit, rationed truth. Rather than simply denying military setbacks, the system acknowledged them selectively and embedded them within a forward-looking narrative frame. A setback in the east, followed by reference to a coming counteroffensive, or a new weapon, or a shift in Allied coalition dynamics that would change the picture. The system had been remarkably effective through the middle years of the war, maintaining public morale through losses that would have collapsed public confidence in a less managed information environment. By April of 1945, the feedback loop was broken. The Gauleiter reports had become unreliable. Many regional party officials had fled, reducing both the geographic coverage and the accuracy of the morale assessments the ministry depended on. Without reliable morale data, the calibration that had made dosierte Wahrheit effective was gone. The system was broadcasting blind. Goebbels was producing content for an audience whose actual state of mind he could no longer accurately assess. Using a distribution network, radio transmitters, printing facilities, newspaper distribution chains, that was contracting daily as Soviet and American forces overran the infrastructure. The Volksempfänger, WW2, the the cheap state-issue radio receiver designed in 1933 specifically to bring Nazi broadcasting into every German household, was an instrument of political engineering embedded in consumer hardware. Its frequency range was deliberately limited. It could not receive the BBC German service, whose broadcasts reached Germany throughout the war on frequencies the Volksempfänger was physically incapable of tuning. This was a design choice, not a technical limitation. The hardware was political. By 1944, however, the German consumer electronics market contained millions of pre-war full-range receivers that were entirely capable of receiving BBC frequencies, and the Gestapo's own surveillance reports, which monitored prohibited foreign radio listening, demonstrate that the BBC German service had a substantial and growing audience throughout the last 2 years of the war. The hardware propaganda had been defeated by the pre-war commercial market. Hans Fritzsche, who directed the radio division of Goebbels' ministry and was one of the most prominent figures in German wartime broadcasting, gave testimony at Nuremberg in 1945 and 46, where he was, remarkably, acquitted. The tribunal found insufficient evidence that his work had directly incited specific atrocities, a verdict that remains contested in the historical literature. In his testimony, Fritzsche described Goebbels in the final weeks of the war in terms that diverge significantly from the picture the diary presents. Junger's memoir and the diary both suggest Goebbels retained genuine ideological conviction. Fritzsche described something closer to a system administrator, maintaining machinery past the point where he believed in the product, dictating with professional polish without the internal investment that had characterized the earlier years. These two accounts cannot be fully reconciled. Either Goebbels was a true believer running a system that had failed, or he was a cynic running a system whose failure he had accepted. Both interpretations have archival support. Neither fully explains the recording from the Zoo Tower, with Soviet guns audible behind the composed voice, and the continued declaration of imminent enemy collapse. The Deutsche Wochenschau, the German weekly newsreel that had been the regime's primary visual propaganda tool throughout the war, continued production until the 22nd of April, 1945. The final edition shows a specific editorial strategy, footage of defensive preparations, of determined-looking soldiers, of what the narration describes as coordinated resistance. No geography is identifiable, no reference to anything that a viewer could compare against a map to determine where the fighting actually was. The production team's meeting notes from those final days, recovered in post-war document collection, show a deliberate decision to omit footage of the Flak Tower's civilian population, on the grounds that images of tens of thousands of civilians sheltering in a military fortress would, as they put it, communicate weakness. The propaganda machinery, in its final days, was not producing content disconnected from reality by incompetence. It was disconnecting from reality by deliberate editorial choice, right up to the end. On the 1st of May, after the failed negotiation with Soviet forces, Goebbels and his wife killed themselves in the Chancellery Garden. He was 47 years old. The ministry he had built and run for 12 years had, in its final weeks, been reduced to a single man recording speeches in a concrete fortress while artillery shook the walls, and then silence. Chapter 12. The Encirclement, the Ninth Army at Halbe. While the world's attention, and the attention of most histories, was fixed on the drama in the bunker and the fighting in the governmental quarter, a completely separate catastrophe was consuming the Spree forests, roughly 50 kilometers southeast of the city. The Ninth Army, under General of Infantry Theodor Buss, had been encircled by the same Soviet operational sweep that had closed the ring around Berlin itself. They were trapped in a pocket of dense pine forest, approximately 400 square kilometers, carrying with them the accumulated human weight of military defeat. Regular soldiers, Waffen-SS remnants, Volkssturm men who'd been swept into the retreat. And this is the detail that makes the Halbe pocket different from a standard military encirclement. Tens of thousands of civilian refugees who had attached themselves to the military column as the only moving thing that offered any prospect of safety. Buss's situation on the 24th of April, when the encirclement was completed, was documented in a radio message to OKW that is one of the more precisely observed military communications of the final weeks of the war. The Ninth Army's strength stood at approximately 100,000 men, down significantly from its pre-battle figures. Available ammunition would sustain roughly 3 to 5 days of sustained combat. Food supplies for approximately 4 days. Motor vehicle fuel for 2 days of movement. He requested either permission to break out to the west toward American lines at the Elbe or relief from Berlin. What he received instead was an order from Hitler to attack northwestward to relieve the Berlin garrison. Busse looked at the order, looked at his army's actual capacity, and made the decision that every competent commander in his position would have made, and that the German command system's political architecture made almost impossible to make openly. He turned his forces west. The distinction between what Hitler ordered and what Busse did has been described by some post-war German accounts as military insubordination. It was, in the strict technical sense. It was also the only decision that gave any portion of his command any prospect of surviving. He wasn't trying to save the war. The war wasn't savable. He was trying to get as many of his men to American captivity rather than Soviet captivity as he could manage. A distinction whose significance anyone with knowledge of how those two captivities subsequently treated their German prisoners would understand immediately. The breakout column, military units, Volkssturm formations, and a mass of civilian refugees moving together across terrain that offered almost no natural cover, moved west through Soviet encircling forces beginning in the last days of April. The town of Halbe sits in the middle of the Spree forest. The fighting around and through that town, between approximately the 28th of April and the 1st of May 1945, is referred to collectively as the Battle of Halbe. I'm going to be direct about the historical record here. Halbe is one of the most significant battles of the entire European war in terms of the scale of death concentrated in a small geographic area, and it appears in virtually no general account of the war's final phase. The Halbe Forest Cemetery today is the largest German war cemetery in Germany. Approximately 15,000 identified burials. The Volksbund Deutsche Kriegsgräberfürsorge, the German War Graves Commission, has been working the Halbe area since the 1950s and continues to recover remains from the forest floor. The work is not finished. The tactical character of the Halbe fighting resists the kind of clean description that most battle narratives depend on. There was no coherent front line. Soviet blocking forces had established positions across the breakout routes, and the German column, which by this point included both military formations capable of organized fighting and masses of civilians and wounded who were not, had to force its way through those positions while simultaneously managing the cohesion of a column that was trying not to fragment. Survivors' accounts describe being under artillery fire from multiple directions simultaneously. They describe not being able to identify where the fire was coming from or which direction offered better cover. They describe the specific terror of moving through a pine forest under shell fire, where trees splinter and fragments of the wood itself become projectiles. The forest didn't shelter anyone. it multiplied the hazard. Estimates of the dead at Halbe run from 40,000 to 60,000 across the multi-day battle, a range that honest historians acknowledge they cannot narrow further with the available evidence. German research has focused on the 15,000 or so buried in the identified cemetery. Soviet operational reports from the period count military prisoners, approximately 60,000, captured from the Ninth Army pocket, according to Soviet records, without systematically addressing what happened to the civilian component of the column. The New York Times, reporting from the area in July of 1945, carried claims of a death toll in the tens of thousands. Those contemporary reports and the immediate post-war accounting were the most honest assessments available at the time. They have not been substantially improved on by subsequent archival work, which tells you something about the nature of the record. Approximately 30,000 soldiers from the Ninth Army's original 100,000-man strength reached American lines at the Elbe and surrendered. They arrived in the days around the 1st and 2nd of May. American forces initially accepted them. Then, under Soviet diplomatic pressure, General Bradley issued orders to stop accepting German military personnel crossing from the east. Some American officers complied immediately. Some did not, and continued accepting crossings for additional hours. That decision, made by individual officers at a river crossing on a specific afternoon, determined the subsequent fate of whatever number of men were still in the water or on the eastern bank when the order took effect. The individuals who made those decisions, on both the German and American sides, were doing so without awareness that they would be noted by history. Most weren't. They made whatever calculation they made in the moment they had with what they knew. The Battle of Halbe is not in most popular histories of the Second World War. It doesn't appear in most documentary accounts of the fall of Berlin. It happened simultaneously with the fighting in the city, with the events in the bunker, with everything else that April and May that the historical memory has decided was important. 40,000 to 60,000 dead in 5 days, in a forest 50 kilometers from the capital, and the history moved on without them almost immediately. I don't have a satisfying explanation for why that is. I just think it should be said plainly. Chapter 13. The Rivalries. There's a particular kind of management that produces exceptional results at exceptional cost, and Stalin was one of its most gifted practitioners. He didn't trust his commanders. He didn't want to trust them. What he wanted was for each of them to be more afraid of failing him than they were of anything the enemy could do. And the instrument he used to produce that fear, consistently across the war, was competition. Set 2 capable men after the same objective. Don't fully coordinate them. Watch what happens. What happened at Berlin in April and May of 1945 was the most consequential and most expensive application of that management philosophy in the entire war. Georgy Zhukov and Ivan Konev were not simply rivals in the personal sense, though they were that too. Their memoirs, published in the post-Stalin Soviet Union, circle each other's reputations with a diplomatic hostility that is almost comical in its precision. They were rivals in a structural sense that Stalin had deliberately engineered. Both commanded army groups of roughly equivalent strength. Both had legitimate operational roles in the Berlin offensive. The boundary between their fronts, the line on the map that determined which formations attacked what, was the tool Stalin used to manage them, and he adjusted it in real time during the battle in ways that no normal command system would permit. The critical adjustment came on the 23rd of April, 1945, when Stalin redrew the boundary between Zhukov's 1st Belarusian front and Konev's 1st Ukrainian front. The new demarcation line was set at the Anhalter Bahnhof in the city's south, close enough to the Reichstag, close enough to the symbolic center of the battle, that Konev's forces now had a theoretical route into the race for the building. This was not an accident of geography or planning. It was a deliberate decision made by one man with an authoritative telephone call, communicated to both commanders in a sequence that left each briefly uncertain about what the other had been told. Zhukov had learned of boundary changes through his own intelligence assets before formal notification reached him. These are the mechanics of institutional competition as command tool, information asymmetry maintained at the top. Now here's where the source conflict becomes genuinely irresolvable in a way I think matters. Zhukov's memoir, published in 1969 after years of editing under conditions that were never fully politically neutral, portrayed the entire Berlin offensive as a smoothly executed, professionally managed operation in which difficulties were overcome through competent generalship. The Seelow delays were manageable. The competition with Konev was collegial. The boundary questions were technical rather than personal. Konev's memoir, 45th, she published in 1966, tells a markedly different story. He described specific moments where Zhukov's operational failures at Seelow created pressures that affected the entire offensive's timeline, where the boundary adjustments created genuine coordination problems, where Soviet units from different fronts were advancing toward the same objectives from different directions without adequate mutual awareness. These aren't subtle differences of emphasis. They describe the same operation so differently that they function, in places, almost as accounts of separate events. Both men were operating under Soviet publishing constraints that shaped what they could say. But their disagreements are too specific and too technically grounded to be simply political performance. The friendly fire dimension of the interfront competition is documented in military police records from the period, and it's the detail that carries the most precise moral weight. Soviet units from the First Belarusian Front and the First Ukrainian Front, advancing toward the same urban objectives from different directions without fully synchronized communication, engaged each other in the Berlin urban area. The NKVD military police records estimate the resulting casualties at somewhere between 600 and 800 Soviet soldiers killed or wounded by fire from their own side. That figure is small relative to total losses. What makes it significant is its cause, not the fog of war in the general sense, but the specific fog generated by a command system that had been deliberately structured to produce competitive aggression rather than coordinated efficiency. The victory banners are worth understanding because they reveal something about how much of the Berlin battle's symbolic dimension was choreographed before the fighting began. 9 banners had been manufactured specifically for the purpose, numbered, and assigned before the offensive opened. Banner number 5 was assigned to the 150th Rifle Division of the 3rd Shock Army, Zhukov's formation. This pre-assignment was a political act that the competition between fronts couldn't actually override. Whoever arrived at the Reichstag first from whatever direction, the banner that would be officially recorded as the victory banner was already designated. She already numbered, already assigned. The race for the building was real. The race for the symbol had already been decided in Moscow before it started. Kaldai's photograph, the one the whole world knows, the soldier on the Reichstag roof with the flag and the burning city below, was taken on the 2nd of May. Kaldai had brought the flag with him specifically, prepared for the shot. The building still contained German defenders in its basement when the photograph was taken. This is not a falsification, exactly. It's the nature of documentary photography in the service of political symbolism, the capturing of a moment that represents a truth. The city had fallen. The war in Europe was effectively over, in a staged arrangement that made that truth visually legible in a way that the actual messy, contested, multi-day reality of taking the building couldn't provide. Zhukov's post-war fate is one of the more striking institutional ironies of the entire story. The man who accepted Weidling's surrender, who presided over the formal end of the Berlin battle, who was photographed at the victory ceremonies, who became the most celebrated Soviet military figure of the war. That man was quietly stripped of his commands in 1946 and sent to command the Odessa military district, one of the least prestigious postings in the Soviet military system. Stalin's reasoning was not, apparently, that Zhukov had failed. It was that he had succeeded too visibly. His popularity after Berlin was too great, his public profile too prominent, and his name too synonymous with Soviet victory in a way that encroached on the symbolic space Stalin reserved for himself. Zhukov spent the years between 1946 and 1948 in Odessa, which survivors of that posting described as a posting that combined real administrative work with the unmistakable quality of being punished for excellence. He was rehabilitated after Stalin's death in 1953, eventually became Minister of Defense, and lived until 1974. But the man who conquered Berlin spent the first years of the Cold War commanding a provincial military district, while the city he'd taken was becoming the most contested piece of real estate on the planet. Chapter 14. The Diplomacy of Surrender. The German surrender was not one event. This is the thing that gets lost in the commemorations, in the clean line of VE Day and its associated celebrations and its annual photographs of jubilant crowds in European capitals. The actual process of Germany stopping the war was a cascade of overlapping, sequential, partly contradictory legal acts conducted by different authorities in different rooms on different days, producing two documents with different signatories that are both, technically, valid instruments of surrender. The dispute between them, a dispute about which ceremony constituted the legitimate act, about which date the war actually ended, is still politically active in 2026, because the Russian Federation observes Victory Day on the 9th of May, and the Western world observes it on the 8th. And those dates reflect different interpretations of the same history. On the 2nd of May, 1945, General Helmuth Weidling was taken to a modest flat in the Tempelhof district of Berlin. Schulenburgring 2, a nondescript apartment building in a neighborhood that had survived the battle better than much of the city. He was in Soviet custody, having surrendered himself to Zhukov's 8th Guards Army. In less than 30 minutes, the paperwork for the surrender of the Berlin garrison was completed. Weidling signed the capitulation order. The document was then broadcast across Berlin via loudspeaker trucks and radio transmissions, calling on German forces throughout the city to lay down their arms. By 3 p.m, most organized resistance had ceased. Some SS units refused to accept the order and continued fighting for additional hours. They were, by that point, deciding to die rather than surrender, which is a category of decision that military history tends to describe as fanatical resistance, and that is probably more accurately described as a consequence of what they believed awaited them in Soviet captivity. On the 4th of May, Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, acting under the authority of the Dönitz government that had been operating from Flensburg-Moerwijk in the far north since Hitler's death, signed a partial surrender covering German forces in northwestern Germany, Denmark, and the Netherlands. The document was signed at British Field Marshal Montgomery's headquarters on the Lüneburg Heath. It was a deliberately partial act. Donitz's government was surrendering to the Western Allies in specific theatres, while keeping whatever formations it could in contact in the East. Not because there was any military objective to be achieved there, but because continued nominal German presence in the East provided cover for the westward movement of civilian and military refugees who were still attempting to reach Western captivity rather than Soviet. Every hour the Flensburg government functioned was, in this calculus, an hour in which more Germans might cross the line. On the 7th of May, at the CIF headquarters in Reims, which was a vocational school that had been requisitioned for the purpose, a building entirely unsuited to the ceremony it was about to host, General Alfred Jodl signed the unconditional surrender of all German armed forces. The ceremony happened at 41 minutes past 2 in the morning. Eisenhower refused to receive Jodl personally. The Supreme Allied Commander spent the formal proceedings in another room and emerged only for a brief appearance after the signing was complete. The document was to take effect at 1 minute past 11 in the evening, on the 8th of May, Central European time. The war in Europe was over, in Western reckoning, at that moment. Stalin found the Reims ceremony insulting and inadequate. His objections were specific. Germany had surrendered to Western Allied officials in a French vocational school, without adequate Soviet representation, without Soviet Marshal Zhukov presiding, in a location that symbolically marginalized the Soviet contribution to the war's outcome. The Soviet Union had lost, by the most credible estimates, somewhere between 25 and 27 million people in the course of defeating Germany. Stalin was not prepared to accept that the formal end of the war should be represented by a signing in Reims, at which a Soviet general was present as a witness rather than a principal. He demanded a second signing. He got one. On the 8th of May, which in Moscow time had become the 9th, Field Marshal Keitel signed again at the Soviet Military Engineering School in Karlshorst, a suburb of Berlin. This time, Zhukov presided. This time the ceremony took place in Germany, in a building on German soil, in the city whose fall had effectively ended the war. This time, the Soviet Union was unambiguously a principal party. The ceasefire took effect at 1 minute past 11, Central European time, the same moment as Reims. But in Moscow time, this was 1 minute past 1 in the morning on the 9th of May. The Soviet Union proclaimed the 9th of May as Victory Day. It has remained so ever since. Here's what I find most revealing about the Donetsk government's 23 days of existence. Its primary concrete achievement was not political. It wasn't ideological. It wasn't some preservation of German state authority for future legal use. It was demographic. Under the cover of continued nominal governmental existence, roughly 1.8 million German soldiers were moved from Eastern to Western captivity or surrender, from the prospect of Soviet imprisonment camps, whose conditions and mortality rates were well understood, to Western Allied custody under conditions that, while not pleasant, were substantially better by every measurable index. Whether those lives constitute a moral justification for a government that was a continuation of the entity responsible for the war itself is a question I'm not going to answer here. But the arithmetic of it is clear, and it explains what Dönitz was actually trying to do in those 23 days, and why he was doing it. British forces arrested the Dönitz government at Flensburg-Mürwik on the 23rd of May. A British officer arrived at Dönitz's headquarters with a prepared order. Dönitz was taken into custody. His government, the last legal successor to the Third Reich, which had survived its creator by 23 days, ceased to exist. Several of its members would subsequently appear at Nuremberg. Dönitz himself was convicted of one count at the tribunal, not crimes against peace or crimes against humanity, but unrestricted submarine warfare, and sentenced to 10 years imprisonment, which he served in full at Spandau prison. He was released in 1956. He died in 1980, the last surviving head of state of Nazi Germany. The typewriter used to produce the Reims surrender document belonged to a Schaeff secretary. It was a standard office typewriter. The document that ended the war in Europe was typed on borrowed office equipment in a requisitioned school at 2:20 in the morning by a tired young woman who has no historical biography. The form of the thing was entirely mundane. The content was not. She's somewhere in the distance between those two facts is most of what official history tends to miss. Chapter 15. Reckoning. The human mathematics. There's a particular kind of historical dishonesty that presents itself as precision. It happens when a historian gives a clean number, a total, a definitive figure, for something that the actual evidence doesn't support stating cleanly. The casualties of the fall of Berlin are that kind of number. Every source has one. They disagree with each other, sometimes by factors of 2 or 3. The disagreements aren't random. They follow political interest with a consistency that is itself evidence, which is why the most useful thing I can do in this chapter isn't give you a number. It's explain why the numbers don't agree and what that disagreement tells us about who was counting and why. Soviet casualties for the Berlin operation, the entire campaign from the Oder crossing through the city's fall, were officially listed in Soviet documents at approximately 361,000 total, of which roughly 81,000 were killed or missing, and approximately 280,000 were sick or wounded. These figures, which appear in post-war Soviet operational records and were the basis for Soviet official histories through the Cold War period, have been subjected to increasing scrutiny since the Soviet archives began to open after 1991. The critique is specific and documented. The Soviet practice of recording soldiers who died of wounds after an operation's official end date as peacetime casualties, rather than attributing them to the operation, systematically deflated operational loss figures across the entire war, not just at Berlin. Historians working in the Russian State Military Archive have estimated that the true number of Soviet soldiers killed in the Berlin operation is likely somewhere between 100,000 and 150,000, roughly double the official figure. The range is that wide because the records themselves are incomplete, because the data was managed for political purposes, and because no independent audit was ever conducted while the evidence was intact. German military casualties present a different archival problem, one that doesn't resolve neatly in the other direction. By April of 1945, German military record-keeping had effectively collapsed. Units that had existed as organized formations on paper had dissolved or amalgamated under fire. Casualty reporting chains were interrupted or simply abandoned. The Wehrmacht's own records from the Berlin operation are fragmentary in a way that reflects genuine organizational failure rather than political management. German post-war research, primarily through the Bundesarchiv Militärarchiv in Freiburg, has produced estimates of German military dead in the operation of approximately 92,000 to 100,000. Soviet operational reports cited German dead at nearly 460,000, a figure that Western historians have consistently found implausible, given what's known of the garrison's actual strength and the duration of the fighting. The Soviet figure includes, almost certainly, deaths from the Halbe pocket and other simultaneous engagements attributed to the Berlin operation in ways that inflate the specific city battle's toll. Neither figure is a lie exactly. Both figures are constructions, and the constructions serve different purposes. The civilian death toll is the most disputed number of all, and for the most complicated reasons. Early West German estimates, based on civil registration data from the immediate post-war period, produced figures in the range of 22,000. The Imperial War Museum's assessment, summarized by its historians as somewhere around 125,000, represents a broader definition that encompasses deaths during the battle itself, deaths from violence during the Soviet occupation in the weeks that followed, suicides among civilians and party officials during and after the battle, and deaths from disease and starvation in the immediate post-war collapse of the city's food and medical infrastructure. Both are defensible as definitions. They produce numbers that differ by a factor of nearly 6. The honest position is that Berlin's civilian death toll from the battle and its immediate aftermath is in a range between 22,000 and 125,000, and that the specific figure within that range depends on definitional choices that are themselves contested. The deaths attributable to the mass violence against women during the occupation, the approximately 10,000 deaths documented by hospital mortality data and retrospective demographic analysis, are recorded in almost no official casualty statistics. They appear, when they appear at all, in medical literature and academic demographic work. They are absent from Soviet operational records entirely. They are largely absent from German civil registration records for the same period, partly because the record-keeping infrastructure had collapsed, and partly because the political atmosphere in both countries in the years immediately following made this category of death one that no official body was inclined to count. I find this absence, the systematic non-counting of a documented category of death, to be itself a form of historical evidence. What gets counted and what doesn't is a record of who had the power to define what mattered. The displaced person's mathematics extends the story beyond May of 1945 in ways that official casualty counts almost never acknowledge. Approximately 14 million ethnic Germans were expelled from Eastern Europe between 1945 and 1947, from Poland, from Czechoslovakia, from the former Eastern German territories, reassigned to Polish administration under the Potsdam Agreements. This demographic displacement was set in motion by the political decisions of the Berlin battle's aftermath. Estimates of the deaths that occurred during these expulsions range from 500,000 to 2 million. A range so wide it reflects the near-total inadequacy of the available documentation. These deaths are not, in any formal military accounting, casualties of the Battle of Berlin. They are, in any honest causal accounting, consequences of it. The German War Graves Commission has been working the Berlin region and the Halbe forest since the 1950s. Their work involves a methodology that is part archaeology, part forensic science, and part simple persistence, surveying ground, recovering remains, attempting identification through available records or, increasingly, through DNA analysis where family references exist. As of recent years, the work is ongoing. The Commission does not expect it to be finished. She, in the sense of having recovered and identified all recoverable remains within any foreseeable time frame. The battle, in the most literal physical sense, is still being counted in 1945's forests. I've looked at a lot of numbers in the course of this project. The one that stays with me isn't a total. It's the NKVD audit note from 1945 that flagged a 12% discrepancy in the other causes category of Soviet casualty records. Deaths that didn't fit neatly into the official reporting categories and were therefore handled by being placed in a notation that the audit found concerning. Someone wrote that note. Someone was honest enough, within a system that was not organized around honesty, to document a discrepancy that they couldn't explain. That note sat classified for approximately 4.5 decades. The person who wrote it has no historical biography, but the note exists and it tells us something important, that the truth was always there, waiting in the records, for someone with access and willingness to look. Chapter 16. The Ruins They Inherited. Berlin on the 3rd of May, 1945, was a city that had stopped being a city in most of the ways that word implies. The water system was non-functional across most of the urban area. Gas supply had ceased. The electricity grid operated intermittently and only in limited sectors. Food distribution, the network of shops, depots, wholesale distributors, and transport connections that in any normal city moves calories from production to consumption, had collapsed. Approximately 2.8 million people were in the rubble, in the basements, in whatever remained of their apartments, waiting for something to start working again. What started working first was the Soviet Occupation Authority, and what it started with was the rationing system. The Soviet approach to occupied Berlin's food supply was tiered by political category in a way that made explicit what occupation actually meant in terms of resource allocation. Workers designated as productive, Schaffender, those whose labor served the occupation's economic needs, received approximately 1,700 calories per day. Normal consumers, the bulk of the non-working population, received roughly 1,200. Former Nazi party members and those classified as politically unacceptable received around 850, a figure that nutritionists at the time documented as below the threshold for long-term physical maintenance. This was not accidental. The caloric structure of the occupation system was a political instrument, and it communicated with the precision of arithmetic what the new hierarchy of the conquered city looked like. You were worth approximately what you produced for the authority that had taken the city, measured in calories per day. Meanwhile, Soviet engineering units were doing something else entirely, working with an efficiency and organization that many Western observers found startling given the chaos of the preceding weeks. Specialized Red Army technical teams were systematically dismantling Berlin's and the surrounding zone's industrial infrastructure, factories, research facilities, power generation equipment, railway locomotives, and rolling stock. The Kaiser Wilhelm Institute's physics laboratory equipment, associated with Germany's wartime scientific research, was removed and shipped east. The estimates of what was taken vary considerably, depending on methodology and what counts as reparations versus looting. In the legal sense, but the range of credible scholarly estimates for the total value of industrial equipment removed from the Soviet zone of Germany between 1945 and 1947 runs from several billion to over $15 billion in 1945 valuations. American occupation officials, surveying what Soviet forces had removed in the weeks before Western Allied forces arrived in their designated sectors in July of 1945, described finding government offices stripped of furniture, telephone exchanges stripped of switching equipment, and buildings stripped of any portable mechanical or electrical component of value. This was organized, systematic, and conducted with the efficiency of units that had prepared for it. It was not looting in the informal sense. It was industrial extraction with political authorization, and it shaped the economic trajectory of both the Soviet zone and the eventual German Democratic Republic for decades. When American, British, and French forces arrived to take up their designated Berlin sectors in July of 1945, they were entering a city that had been under Soviet administration for approximately 2 months. and that bore the physical marks of that administration in specific and documented ways. The Allied Control Council, the four-power governance body established to administer Germany, began its work immediately, producing documents of careful procedural precision about a city that, in the neighborhoods below those documents, still had no reliable water supply, and where the primary daily preoccupation of most of its 2.8 million residents was finding enough food to sustain the next day. The Trümmerfrauen, the rubble women, became the human symbol of Berlin's reconstruction in the decades that followed. Approximately 60,000 women were conscripted by occupation authorities to work on rubble clearance, which made them roughly 5% of the city's female population. This is worth pausing on. The Trümmerfrau became a foundational image of post-war West German national identity. The woman with her bucket and her sorting line, reclaiming habitable space from destruction through sheer human persistence. The image was real in the sense that real women did real work. But the image was mythologized in a way that historian Leonie Treber's research has systematically documented. The primary mechanism of rubble clearance was not human chains of women with buckets. It was professional workers and mechanical equipment, excavators, trucks, organized demolition, that moved the overwhelming majority of 75 million cubic meters of debris. The Trümmerfrau as individual worker existed. The Trümmerfrau, as the primary agent of Berlin's physical reconstruction, was a post-war image built from selective visibility and selective silence. And that myth-building, crucially, stripped from the image everything that surrounded those women's actual circumstances. The context of occupation, the coercion of conscription, the mass sexual violence that had occurred in the preceding weeks. The reconstruction image was constructed specifically to be the opposite of all that, to show strength, order, agency, forward movement, to show what the culture preferred to see. The Allied Control Council agreement that formalized Berlin's four-power administration was a document of considerable procedural elegance governing a situation of considerable practical instability. Berlin sat 100 miles inside the Soviet occupation zone of Germany. Western Allied access to the city depended on Soviet cooperation through designated road, rail, and air corridors. 3 air corridors of 20 miles width each, connecting Berlin to Western German airfields, established by the Allied Control Authority in November of 1945. The legal status of those corridors was clear enough. The Soviet willingness to respect them was a political question, not a legal one. And it was a question that would receive its definitive first testing in June of 1948. The Nuremberg Tribunal opened on the 18th of October, 1945. The men in the dock had helped build the regime that produced the ruins. The tribunal now operated in the ruins' proximity. The London Charter of August of 1945, which established the legal framework for the proceedings, she created 3 categories of crime: crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. These categories, improvised to address a scale and character of official criminality that existing international law hadn't anticipated, became the foundational architecture of international criminal law. The International Criminal Court, the war crimes tribunals of the 1990s and beyond, the legal language in which the 21st century debates accountability for atrocity, all of it builds on what was written in London in the summer of 1945. In direct response to what had been done and what had been seen in the preceding 6 years. The city that the Nuremberg proceedings were indirectly built around, the city whose fall marked the end of the regime being tried, was simultaneously being divided by the administrative machinery of the four-power agreement into the political geography that would define the Cold War. The wall wasn't built yet. That came in 1961. but the framework that made the wall possible. The division of the city, the access corridors, the dependency of Western presence on Soviet tolerance was all established in the documents and the practical arrangements of 1945 and 46. The men writing those documents knew some of what they were building. They couldn't have known all of it. Chapter 17. What the ruins remember. I want to be direct about something at the start of this chapter. The previous 16 have used specific historical figures as lenses. The cartographer, the general, the artillery officer, the diarist, the secretary. This one doesn't. This one is mine. Not because the history is over, but because 80 years of distance requires someone to stand in the present and say plainly what they see, rather than continuing to arrange other people's testimony as a way of avoiding the act of interpretation. So this is the interpretation. There is a place in central Berlin, on Niederkirchner Straße, a short walk from the Brandenburg Gate, where the foundations of the Gestapo headquarters have been excavated and left exposed. The building that stood above them was destroyed in the battle. The foundations were discovered during construction work in 1987, and a decision was made, not to build over them, not to memorialize them in the usual sense of a monument or a plaque, but to leave them open, to make the excavated remains of the place where the terror apparatus was housed into a place you could walk down into and stand in and look at the brick and the concrete and the documentary record mounted on panels around you. They called it the Topographie des Terrors, the topography of terror. It's an outdoor museum now, covered and documented, visited by millions. But the foundational decision was about what to do with evidence. Keep it visible, keep it in the ground of the city it helped destroy. Don't let it become abstract. That decision, made in 1987, before the wall fell, and before reunification, before the long reckoning of what a unified Germany owed its own history, seems to me to be the most important single decision made about Berlin since the surrender. Not because of its scale, because of what it refused. It refused the smoothing over. It refused the conversion of evidence into symbol at the expense of the evidence itself. The Gestapo foundations are still in the ground. They're still made of the original brick. The weather still reaches them. The wall went up on the 13th of August, 1961. Overnight, East German workers began laying barbed wire and concrete block along the border between East and West Berlin, while the city slept, and by morning, the division was physical fact rather than administrative arrangement. The wall ran for 155 kilometers around West Berlin, incorporating the pre-existing division that the Four-Power Agreement of 1945 had established. Checkpoint Charlie, the most famous crossing point, the one that became the Cold War's most photographed border, stood approximately 400 meters from where the heaviest street fighting of April and May of 1945 had occurred. The wall was built on the ruins of the battle, literally and structurally. The division it embodied had been made possible by the decisions taken in the ruins' immediate aftermath. 28 years later, on the 9th of November, 1989, the wall came down. The sequence of events that produced that night, popular pressure in East Germany, governmental paralysis in the East German leadership, a press conference at which a spokesman incorrectly announced that crossing was immediately permitted, crowds gathering at the checkpoints, guards who had received no orders standing aside, was as chaotic and improvised as anything in the history the wall was built to contain. It was not planned. It was not a smooth transfer of power. It was a system collapsing faster than its managers could understand, and people walking through the gaps. Within 18 months, Germany was reunified. On the 12th of September 1990, the treaty on the final settlement with respect to Germany was signed in Moscow, what everyone involved called the 2+4 Treaty. The two Germanys plus the four wartime Allied powers. The treaty's central function was to terminate all remaining Allied rights and responsibilities in Germany, including those pertaining to Berlin. It was, in the most precise legal sense, the final document of World War II, signed 45 years after the war ended, because the 1945 surrender had never fully resolved Germany's legal status as a sovereign state, and because the framework established in the ruins had required 4.5 decades to finally dismantle. The Reichstag building, the physical structure over which Kaldai's flag was raised in the photograph, was wrapped in silver fabric by the artist Christo in 1995. A temporary installation that drew 5 million visitors in 2 weeks and prompted a global conversation about what the building meant and what Germany was becoming. Then it was renovated by the British architect Norman Foster, whose design added the famous glass dome that turns sunlight into the legislative chamber below. The renovation preserved something that a lesser architectural brief might have removed: the graffiti that Soviet soldiers inscribed on the building's interior walls in April and May of 1945. Names in Cyrillic, hometowns, dates, the small personal records that soldiers leave on surfaces when they've taken something at enormous cost and want to mark the fact of their presence there. Those inscriptions are now behind protective glass panels in the corridors of the German Bundestag. The men who wrote them, teenagers and 20-year-olds from Omsk and Tashkent and Dnipropetrovsk, who had survived 4 years of the Eastern Front and made it to Berlin, are still there. Inside the legislature of the reunified German democracy, they helped create, preserved under glass by the people who inherited what they built and what they destroyed simultaneously. Here is what I think about when I think about that detail. Those soldiers didn't know they were creating a historical exhibit. They were doing what soldiers do when they survive something that should have killed them, marking a wall to say, I was here. I made it. Whatever comes next, I was here. The political system they served had its own motivations for their presence at that wall, motivations that those individual soldiers may or may not have shared or understood or cared about. What they left behind was personal. The German parliament chose to preserve it. That choice, made in a democratic institution that didn't exist before the battle that produced those inscriptions, is one of the more quietly remarkable acts of historical acknowledgement in the post-war record. The symbolism of the fall of Berlin has not remained in the past, where history would prefer to keep it. In 2022, when Russian forces began a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, Russian state media and official government communications deployed the language and imagery of 1945 with a consistency that cannot be read as accidental. The framing of the military operation as denazification, the use of the letter Z as a symbol directly evoking wartime victory imagery, to the invocation of the Great Patriotic War as the justifying historical reference for a 21st century invasion, all of it reached directly back to the fall of Berlin and the Soviet victory as its founding moral and historical claim. History was not being cited. It was being used as a weapon in an active conflict. The 80-year-old imagery of Kaldai's flag photograph, the 80-year-old language of anti-fascist struggle, the 80-year-old emotional architecture of Soviet sacrifice, these were being deployed by a state to justify military action against a neighboring country. Whatever one thinks of the political claims involved, the historical mechanism is clear. The fall of Berlin remains available as an instrument of political mobilization in ways that most Western historical events simply aren't. The May 8th versus May 9th question. Which date the war actually ended, which surrender was the legitimate one, is not a historical curiosity in 2026. It is a live political fault line visible in commemoration ceremonies, in diplomatic scheduling, in the language that governments use when they speak about the war's legacy. The dispute begins in a signing ceremony in a Reims vocational school at 41 minutes past 2 in the morning on the 7th of May, 1945. And it has not ended. It has changed form, changed register, changed geopolitical context. But the underlying disagreement about who bore the decisive burden of the war and who therefore has the legitimate authority to define its meaning is structurally identical to what was argued in the months and years immediately after the surrender. The German War Graves Commission is still working in the Halbe forest. The forensic archaeologists are still working in the ground. The demographic historians are still refining their estimates. The Soviet-era archives are still being processed and translated and cross-referenced with German records and British records and American records, producing new conclusions about old events at a pace that suggests the history of the Berlin battle will not be complete, in the sense of having a stable, agreed, comprehensively documented account within my lifetime, or probably the lifetime of most people reading this. I think that's correct. I think it should be. Not because the truth is permanently inaccessible, but because the scale of what happened resists the kind of closure that popular history tends to reach for. The clean ending, the settled account, the moment at which the past becomes the past, rather than a continuing argument about what we owe it and each other. Berlin in 1945 didn't produce a clean ending. It produced the structures that the next 80 years of European history operated within. The Cold War's architecture, the legal framework of international criminal accountability, the ongoing demographic and psychological consequences of the violence of those weeks, and, in the walls of the Bundestag, behind glass, in Cyrillic, the specific human traces of specific people who were there and wanted to say so. That's what the ruins remember. Not a victory, not a defeat, not even a lesson. A record. Partial, contested, still being assembled. Theirs and ours simultaneously, in ways that no amount of commemorative distance makes entirely past tense.